You didn't lose God when church pushed you out. That's actually when his pursuit of you intensified. Because I know what that experience does to a person. You showed up, you served, you gave more than you probably should have, and then not gently, not privately, they let you go. Or they pushed you out, or they made the environment so unbearable that leaving felt like your only option. And the wound wasn't just the rejection. The wound was the silence from heaven that came after it. You expected God to intervene, to vindicate you, to make them see what they were losing, and he didn't. The rejection happened anyway. And now you carry this fracture not just in your relationship with church, but in your understanding of God's protection. And here's what happens if you don't resolve that fracture. You rebuild your spiritual life on a cracked foundation. You either return to church and perform recovery you don't actually feel, smiling through the scar tissue, or you walk away from God entirely because you can't separate him from the people who failed you. Both options leave the real wound untouched, and an untouched wound doesn't stay still, it spreads. There is a third thing happening, though, one that almost nobody in the church hurt conversation ever names. The rejection wasn't the end of God's attention toward you. It was the beginning of a completely different kind of it. Think about what actually happens when something gets released from one gravitational field. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't drift aimlessly in the dark. That's not how physics works, and it's not how God works either. When an object is released from one orbit, it gets claimed by the next strongest gravitational pull. What the church called pushing out, heaven called pulling in. You weren't ejected. You were claimed. And if that sounds too clean to be true, too neat for the mess you actually lived through, I want to show you something, because this isn't a spiritual soundbite. It's one of the most consistent patterns in all of Scripture, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Joseph's brothers were his community, his family, the people God placed around him from birth. And they rejected him so completely they assigned a price to him and handed him to strangers, not metaphorically. Literally, they sat down and ate a meal while they negotiated the transaction, and God watched it happen. He didn't send an angel to stop it. He let the rejection go all the way through. 40 years later, Joseph is standing over the food supply of nations, not in spite of the rejection, because of where the rejection moved him. Moses tried to stand up for his people and got rejected so completely he ran alone into the wilderness. 40 years of nobody, of silence, of being removed from every community that was supposed to give him purpose. And that's exactly where God found him, not in the temple, not surrounded by religious community, not in the space where everybody was performing their faith, at a burning bush, alone, outside the system entirely. David was anointed by God, chosen, set apart, God ordained, and then hunted by the very king who was supposed to represent God's authority on earth. He spent years in caves, writing his prayers into songs because there was no congregation to perform them for. And those songs, the ones born in the absolute isolation of rejection, became the most intimate prayers in human history. Billions of people still carry them. Paul, a man so embedded in the religious institution that he was its enforcement arm, and then God didn't just call him out of it. God made the institution reject him so completely that his only available path went toward the people the institution had already decided were irrelevant. The pattern is not subtle. God's most significant assignments almost never begin in the center of religious community. They begin on the outside of it. And here is where everything shifts, because you've probably been asking the wrong question this entire time. The question most people ask after church rejection is, why did God allow them to reject me? But the real question, the one that reorganizes everything, is this: what could only have been built in the space that rejection created? Because community approval has a weight to it that most people don't notice until it's gone. When you need people to validate your calling, you unconsciously shape your calling to fit what they'll approve. You trim the edges, you soften the parts that make people uncomfortable. You make yourself smaller so you fit inside their definition of acceptable. You don't even realize you're doing it because the approval feels like confirmation. Church rejection strips that away, harshly, publicly, sometimes permanently. But it strips away something else too, the version of your faith that only worked when other people were watching. What remains when the audience disappears, that is the real thing. That is what God was after. But I want to be honest with you here, because this is the part that's harder to sit with. Not every church rejection was God protecting you from a toxic environment. Some of it may have involved your own unhealed wounds, your own expectations, the places in you that made authentic community feel unsafe, the version of belonging you were asking church to provide that no human institution was ever designed to carry. The rejection was real. The pain was real, but so is the possibility that some of what you were asking the church to give you, unconditional safety, full visibility, the kind of belonging that never misunderstands you, that search was always going to be incomplete. Not because you were too broken to belong, but because you were looking for what only one relationship can actually hold. And sometimes the rejection, the one that felt like the end, is what removes you from a search that would never have found its answer there. Which means this: you may have left church carrying the wound, but you left carrying the one thing that institutional religion can quietly, accidentally steal from you: the desperate need to find God apart from performance, apart from the approval of the room, apart from the politics of belonging. And that search, the one that begins in the wreckage of healing from church hurt, tends to find something that formal religion rarely produces: not information about God, direct contact. Here is the truth that may take time to fully settle in you. The intensity of the pursuit you felt from God during and after that rejection, the way He seemed to show up in the silence, in the wilderness, in the places that had nothing to do with a church calendar, that wasn't coincidental. God speaks loudest in the space where human noise has stopped. Every moment you were no longer performing your faith for an audience. Every prayer you prayed when no one was watching to be impressed by your consistency. Every time you opened scripture not to prepare a lesson for someone else, but because you were simply, desperately yourself. Every moment of unguarded conversation with a God you couldn't perform for, that was Him. That was the pursuit, not the one that happens in buildings, the one that happens in the broken open. The church didn't abandon you to silence. It cleared space for a voice you'd been too busy to hear clearly. And this is what changes when you fully receive that. The rejection stops being evidence that you were wrong or too difficult or not anointed enough or too damaged to belong. It becomes the beginning of a different kind of qualification. The people God tends to use to build something that actually heals the church, they are almost never the ones who moved through it untouched. They are the ones who carry the specific, hard-won knowledge of what it costs when community becomes performance. They understand, at a cellular level, the damage that happens when approval becomes someone's oxygen. They can see what others miss because they've been on the outside of it and still found God there. Church rejection doesn't disqualify you from your spiritual calling. In the hands of a God who wastes nothing, it qualifies you for the kind of ministry that heals instead of replicates the wound. There is one last thing worth carrying with you: the community that rejected you and the community you may one day build or find, they are not the same thing. What gets built from a place of having known that specific loneliness will look different. It will feel different, because it won't be built on performance or polished theology or the kind of belonging that only works for people who already fit. It will be built from the particular mercy that only someone who has been outside knows how to offer. The question was never whether God allowed the rejection. He did. The question is what you do with the person it forged, because that person, the one who found God after the church let go, carries something the institution rarely produces on its own. And what they carry, the world is quietly, desperately waiting for.